Okay, welcome. I hope you guys are ready. So there's been a bit of confusion about the title of this seminar. I don't know if you noticed that. In one part of the program it said keep it simple, and in the other part it said Church for the Lost. So this is the seminar about how to build a missional culture. So I hope that's the one you came for. You still have time to run out if that's not what you wanted. Is there anyone who knows anything about these lights who could dim them just a little bit? Because I feel like I'm a rock star right now. Thanks. Great. Okay.
You don't feel comfortable to be in light.
Sorry?
You don't feel comfortable to be in light.
No, exactly. I'm not very comfortable. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself and maybe the reason for doing this seminar. I don't at all feel like I know all that needs to be said about how to build a missional culture. That's like a huge subject, how to have a church culture that actually reaches people, especially people in our cities and countries that don't know Jesus yet. So how to do that is like a huge topic, and I'm just going to touch on a few basic things. But my background for talking about this is that my wife Sarah and I, we planted a church. We moved nearly 2 years ago to a city in Denmark called Odense. And I'm sorry, that is the best pronunciation I know to give you. But we actually had a calling to do that about 3 years ago on the conference here in the first one that was here in Copenhagen. Basically, we heard stories from people like James and Jen and other people who had planted churches, and we just felt God said to us that this was the time for us to actually move on to do it. So we planted a church. Started the church had its birth on the 1st of September 2012, and we had moved a team of just 5 adults to this new city, which is about 150 kilometers from here. And so we faced this challenge of how do you start a church? What do you do? You sit you're in a new house, you're in a new city, you don't know anybody. We hadn't even brought a cat or anything like that, so we were just completely alone. And so we have this idea of what to do. And actually, I'm going to tell the story about how we planted the church and what we did and all that tomorrow in a seminar about church planting. So I'm not going to explain all that for you today. But one of the things that really was on our hearts when we moved was that we wanted the church to be a church that primarily tried to reach people who don't know Jesus yet. I mean, if any Christians wanted to come and hang out and be part of the vineyard in Odense, that would be great, obviously. Perfect, everybody welcome. But we had a heart for becoming a church that also had some relevance to people who have never been part of a church, not grown up in a church, have no reference for anything of what we believe in. So how do you do that? And one of the big advantages, the big challenge of planting a church is you just start from nothing. But one of the big advantages also is that you pretty much just start from nothing. And in the beginning, you can do whatever you want to do, and you can do it just the way you want, right? So you can actually build a certain culture from the beginning. And just to give you an idea of where we are today, we've been going for about 20 months, and we have the church is about 60, 70 people now in sort of the fellowship of the church. And we have services every Sunday, and we are about 50-something on average on our Sundays. I would say that probably between 20 and 30%, probably it could be more than that, but probably between 20 and 30% of the church have no church background. It's their first church, and which is amazing. I mean, that's just completely amazing for us to see that. And just this week, we had a really great week this week so far, because on this Sunday at our service, we had a baptism. The first one we've done on a Sunday. We baptized 4 new Christians in their early 20s that have all come to faith in our church. So that was an amazing party. We had bought the kind of thing you use for a home birth, kind of a pool, and we just placed it in our in our place where we have our services, our normal services. It's a place that we rent, so the guys were a little bit suspicious about that. So we just did that, filled it with water, and then we just baptized them right there in the middle, in front of the stage. So it's an amazing party, amazing vibe to it. So we've seen a number of people come to faith. I'm not sure how many. Some would receive Jesus and maybe move on. Some would become part of the church, and some would be somewhere in between, maybe in a process of connecting with Jesus, connecting with us, connecting with the whole idea of being a Christian. So I would say somewhere between 20 and 25 people have more or less come to faith in what we've been doing. And for me, the definition of what it means to have a missional culture or to be a missional church is that the church is a place, is something that comes into a city and transforms the city. So the church is there to transform the city and not the other way around, right? And we're not transforming it with knowing things better than anybody else. We're not transforming the city by being smarter or being right and telling everybody else they're wrong. We're simply trying to transform the city with the love of God, with the love of Jesus, and trying to spread that into the city that we're part of. So I've borrowed a little bit of a definition today from a guy called Mark Driscoll. Maybe you know of him. He's an American, and he's planted a church in a big city called Seattle, which is now I think 4,000 or 5,000 people, that he planted right from the start himself. And he has a very sharp definition on what a missional church looks like. I don't agree with everything he says, but I love his definition of missional church. So let's just take a look at that for a minute to see the difference between the old kind of church, the more traditional kind of church, and then what a missional church is. So, click. Here we go. Mark uses 3 different definitions of church, and I just want to quickly go through them. The first one is the traditional church. That would be the kind of church that maybe some of you have grown up in. They're still present in most Western countries. Kind of old-fashioned church. It would be in Denmark. It would be the state church in many places, but it could also be many other denominations that have a very strong tradition. Then the middle one he calls the contemporary church, which is probably the kind of church I grew up in, which is more of a modern church, but still not a church that sees a lot of people come to faith and really reaches beyond itself. And then finally, he has the definition of a missional postmodern church, which is the kind of church that he's pastoring. So let's just go through these 3 just really quick and see if you can see the pattern. So let's have the first one more time. Yes. First, we have the traditional church. Let's try and define that. These are obviously very general definitions, so you couldn't say, every traditional church is just like this, but just kind of an overview. A traditional church, the whole idea of missions is something where you send off money usually to an agency, and then they send out some missionaries to Africa, right? Or to Asia or whatever, some third world country. So missions is about sending missionaries somewhere, and what the church mostly does is just send money, basically. A traditional church exists primarily to meet the needs of its members, right? So when the church is looking at what should we do, they look at what do the members need? What are the needs in the church, in our congregation? Most growth in a traditional church is through birth, or if people are moving from one city to another and need to find a church, and they would look for a church of the same kind. So maybe if you came from a Baptist church in one city, when you move to a new city, you would look for another Baptist church, right? So that would be a way of growth. In a traditional church, community means that the church is actually a subculture. You've probably never experienced this in church life, that it's almost like a church has its own culture, and it is kind of close to outsiders, and if anyone from the outside comes in, it'll feel different to them, almost as if they went to another country, or to a different culture, you know? You know that feeling when you walk into a room and it feels like you've walked in on a family dinner? and you don't really belong, you don't really know what's going on. That's how many people feel about going into a traditional church. In a traditional church, a pastor is someone who is selected and trained at a seminary. That means outside the actual church. So they go somewhere, and they go to train in this school, and then they come back to be a pastor. And basically, the pastor is hired to do all the work. So that would be especially things like ministry and speaking and evangelizing. That's the pastor's job. That's what we're paying him for. Faith is something that's private and something that's personal. There's often a great deal of being anonymous in a traditional church. And finally, where did I go? Yeah, finally, the worship services, when we actually meet on Sundays, is based on tradition. You would have hymnals, you would have an old church organ playing, you would have certain liturgies, certain ways of doing things that you've done them for hundreds and hundreds of years and so on. So very traditional. So I guess you can probably recognize a church in your context that's like this. Then he goes on to say there's something called the contemporary church. Let's try and compare that. Next one, please. Marco? Next, please. Thanks. The contemporary church is sort of the in-between. And I think that, in the Vineyard, we probably don't recognize the traditional church much. We really don't. We're really a very young church tradition. But in the contemporary church, which is something that's very much existed, especially in the 80s and 90s, I think many of us will recognize some of these things and say, this is probably more of what our church is like. So in a contemporary church, missions is not just something that's going on in a different country. It's something that's in our country too, but it's something that we have a department. We have a missions pastor, and he leads the missions department, and so he can go on and do the missions in the church, right? So we think of it as a part of sort of a department in the church. And in a church, it doesn't just exist to meet the members of the church, but we think about people as spiritual consumers. So people in our society, what kind of spiritual sort of goods are they looking for? And then we try to accommodate that, right? So that makes a great difference to how we actually do church. We think a lot about what do people want? What is the things that would work for them, and so on. And the whole idea of having seeker-sensitive services and all of those kind of definitions would come from this. Churches grow through marketing. You have marketing for certain events. You put on a church event that you think this one is especially suited for newcomers, and then you advertise for that, and you ask all the members to go and invite people and give them a flyer or whatever. In a contemporary church, community means that the church is still a subculture. It's still different, and it's a safe place, but it's also something that invites people into this culture. So we find a way to invite people who are lost into the church culture. And it's still quite different from what is outside. In a contemporary church, we have a much more business way of thinking about church leadership. So the pastor is basically a CEO. He's a boss. And he has a lot of staff that he can lead and manage and make sure that everybody does what they're hired to do. And while faith is still something private and personal, which it is in the modern generation, it's okay to sort of display that when you're together on Sundays, right? So on a Sunday, or when you're together in the church, it's okay to sort of display emotion and openly confess your faith, even though it's still a private thing. And basically, the worship service will be based on the styles that come from the same period. So again, as I said, this is typically for the 80s and 90s, so you would have someone playing acoustic guitar, you would have drama, you would have all of the things I grew up with from places like Willow Creek and so on that did things differently at that time. That's what you would call a contemporary church. So maybe you recognize some of this from some of the churches you've visited or read about, or even from your own church. And then finally, Mark goes on to say, this is good, but what is a missional church that reaches into a postmodern culture? What does that look like? And so this is his definition of a missional church, like the one that he is pastoring in Seattle. He says, first of all, missions is something that every Christian is acting out in the local culture. So every Christian is a missionary to the city that they live in. That's a totally different way of thinking. Almost as if we had all moved to a different country to be missionaries. Let's say you moved to Beijing in China to be a missionary, and you got a job there, and you went to church, and then the rest of the time you just, were a missionary. That's basically the same thing, except you haven't moved anywhere. That's what he's saying. Churches are people who love Jesus and serve his mission in a local culture. So the church is actually on a mission, and that's what it is, what a church is, something that's there to transform. And the way churches grow, and this is interesting, the way churches grow is that people bring Jesus to lost people. So people actually go from the church and they go into the culture and they bring Jesus to people through hospitality in different ways, through inviting people into their fellowship. And there's a lot more that can be said about that, and I will say a bit more about that. He also says community means the church is a counterculture with a kingdom way of living. So instead of being sort of a safe place where we have our own kind of Christian culture and we all know what to expect from each other, actually what we're trying to do is to build a kingdom counterculture. So we say the culture outside is not bad. It's not, the Danish or the Swedish or the Norwegian or the Finnish culture is not bad. But there are some things that are different in a kingdom culture, and that's why it's a bit of a counterculture. And when people come in, that's the culture they will meet, and that will have an immediate effect on them, and maybe even immediate appeal on them. And pastors, and this is again very interesting and very different, pastors' main job is to train Christians to be effective missionaries. That's the job description, to train Christians to be effective missionaries. And faith is not private and personal anymore. Faith is something that's lived out publicly, together at the church, and even in our homes, in our personal lives. It's a public thing. It's something that we're open about and sharing about with anybody and everybody. And then finally, the worship services, they're not traditional, and they're not contemporary. They're not 80s or 90s or 70s or anything else, but they're trying to blend whatever style is current. I mean, what is the norm? What is kind of the musical style and all that in the world right now? But also to blend in some really ancient styles, things like really old, maybe 1,000-year-old practices, and kind of mix it together in something that reaches back into history. So it's not only, it doesn't have to be the hip thing, the hip new thing all the way. We could also have a hymnal from the year 300 that has a special meaning to us, right? So you kind of mix that together. So those are his definitions. By the way, if you have any questions or anything, just fire away. Yeah?
Where does the vineyard fit in?
That's a good question. That's the thing. The question was, where does the vineyard fit in? I think it's quite obvious that the vineyard was birthed in what was the contemporary church and has probably helped define it even, as one of the first churches that really did that. And I think the great challenge for us is how to transition from that into being a missional church. I can't remember who I spoke to. I was speaking to someone a couple of years back who said, I think it was Anders Michael, who's also coming this weekend. He said, the main task for any church in the Western society, any Western church, is whether or not they are able to transition to become a missional church. And that's the difference. It doesn't matter what denomination, whatever, it doesn't matter. But it's whether we can transition into being missional. If we can learn that, if we can get that, then we will still reach people for Christ. It's not about the country or the city being specifically difficult. It's not about, it's not about the gospel losing its power. It's not about all that. It's about the churches becoming missional and transition into a new way of doing church. So I think I sound like I'm very convincing. I'm not. I don't know if I'm right about that, but that would be my take on it. That's where we need to go. Any other questions?
I have a short comment on this. Also, I think that also compared to traditional church and what was the previous one.
Sorry, I didn't get.
What was the church in the middle? What was
The contemporary, yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
one thing is that whether the church is not discipling, because in Finland we have how to say event-oriented churches, which organizes events,
Yeah.
but actually people are never actually met or faced, and they are not trying to grow.
Yeah.
And they don't have necessarily any hope themselves also. I actually work in the Lutheran church, so we had a Thomas, what is Thomas name in English? So quite modern style or event, and a lot of people were involved. They just came to the same place and then left without meeting anybody. But they like the music and they like to speak, but nobody met each other. I worked 1 year in that kind of ministry.
Yeah.
Funny, I didn't become a friend of anybody.
Right.
Everybody was happy since they came to the meeting and left the building.
Right.
What counts so that if I discipling people in this focus. So I think that's also one dimension which is not mentioned here.
Right. Good point. Yeah. Norbert?
Just a comment. I think the seed for the missional church has been in the vineyard DNA,
Yeah.
but it hasn't broken through. It was when John Wimber died and Todd Hunter took over, he made the famous statement, mission is not what we do, but who we are. So there was an understanding of these truths, but it hasn't filtered through and hasn't really evolved
Right.
yet. So I think we're in that process between the two.
Yeah. I think so too. And I think, the world changes, and that's why sometimes when people say, we should just go back to doing what we did in the beginning, like in the 80s, and I'm thinking that's not really the solution, because the world is different, right? So there was a great missional DNA in that time, but it was not a postmodern society. So there's something different in what you're trying to reach, right? In sort of the society has moved on since that. So we have to do things a little bit differently, I think. Yeah. Any other questions? I'll move on a little bit. I want to talk about 3 things basically based on this, because now I've kind of compared things. That's all great, but then how do we actually build a missional culture? And for me, it's not enough to just look at these points and say, "Oh, I just go and do that." It gets a little bit difficult to grasp what's it all about. So I want to talk about, first of all, what does a missional culture look like in a scattered environment when we're not in the church together? What does a missional culture look like in a gathered environment when we meet for Sunday services and so on? And then I want to talk about how do you actually build culture? How do you, as a leader, especially, how do you build a culture into a certain way? And just give some ideas about that. So first of all, if we can have the next one, let's have a look at what you call scattered environments. So scattered means that we're spread out. So one of the main ideas of a missional postmodern culture is that the church is not only the church when we meet on a Sunday, that's not necessarily, that's just one expression of church. But that there's another expression of church, and that's on Monday when we're all over the city. And we're still the church. And we're still on mission, but now we're not in the same place. So that this whole idea of being sent out into the city, and figuring out what is the task that Jesus is sending me into on Monday morning when I go to work or when I go to my college or whatever I do. So it starts with having an identity and a clear definition of being sent to the city. And this one particular point that I just read before, that Mark Driscoll says that Christians are bringing Jesus to lost people through hospitality. And there are so many ways you can do that, but the whole idea is not bringing people to church to meet Jesus as much as you're bringing Jesus to people for them to meet him. And as I usually say to the people in our church, I say, you know what? It's just so much easier to invite people to church after they've received Jesus, right? I mean, it's just a lot easier to try and convince them why it's relevant. And so, how can you bring Jesus to people with hospitality? There's many ways you can do that. You can bring Jesus to people through building relationships, inviting people into your home, inviting people for coffee. You can do that by including people that are maybe marginalized, people that are lonely, people that have few friends. You can do that by helping people who have great needs. A lot of churches that are growing, they have programs where things like social programs where they help a lot of people who have great needs, right? And so many people come to faith through that because of the hospitality they receive. You can do that in really a number of ways. You can go to the streets and do healing on the streets. Again, if someone gets healed by the power of Jesus, and then you tell them about the power of Jesus, and then you invite them to church, that sometimes can be a little bit easier, again, than just trying to explain why it's such a great thing to people. So there's something about this bringing God into the world rather than the other way around. Sometimes we think, we sit in church and we pray to God and we say, "Oh God, please bring people to my church so I can tell them about Jesus." I don't know if you've ever done that. I certainly have. I'm leading a church too, so I really have. And sometimes I just think God is saying, you know what, why don't you, you've got the wrong way around. Why don't you go out and get some people and bring them to the church, and then I will take care of them, basically. Let me give you another example of this principle. Last summer, I was talking to Alan Scott, who is leading a church that's just growing tremendously at the moment in Northern Ireland. And I asked him, and I said, okay, so what do you do when you have all these people coming to faith? Because we had just a few people coming to faith. And I was really wondering, what do I do with them? How do I disciple them and teach them and all of that? What do we do? And I asked him, so what do you do with all those people coming to faith and starting to, join the church? And he just looked at me, he said, we don't really do anything. Well, yes, we do one thing. We just send them out serving lost people. You just find opportunities for them to serve lost people. And that's it. And there was no program, there was no, golden key to how to disciple them. That is discipleship in his mind. So I think that's great. The way I phrase it sometimes when I talk about our vision to our people, I say, we're a church that exists primarily for the city and not for ourselves. We don't exist for us here in this room. We exist for everybody else, right? And that's a mindset and a way you have to think about yourselves. And so it's not about our needs so much. It's not about what we want. And, I don't like the music that way and all of that stuff. It doesn't really matter. We don't exist for that. We exist for the people who are not yet here and who don't know Jesus yet. Another thing that Alan Scott says about the whole thing about discipleship and how to disciple people is, he says this, that sometimes as Christians we think discipleship is to become really spiritual in our own sort of secret life. I love Tom's talk just this morning. But sometimes we think the goal for us is how much we read the Bible and pray. And we think, I read so and so much, and then I actually pray for like 30 minutes. I actually do that every day, and I'm really disciplined, and and look at my life. I'm not, doing anything wrong. I'm really trying to, live the way I should and be good to my wife and everything. And we think, oh, so I'm a disciple, and I'm really discipled. And sometimes we look at people in our churches and we think that's the goal for them, to, get really almost domesticated in a way. And really, what Alan Scott is saying is that's not really discipleship. That's just like training. It's just like training your muscles just for people to see how great your muscles are. But you're not really using them for anything. So you can show them like a bodybuilder. Look at my great big muscles, but you don't use them for anything. So really, he says, discipleship is not a measure of how much you train your spiritual muscles. It's a measure of how much you use them. And he puts it like this. It's one way of putting it. He says, the goal is for you as a Christian to bring life to the city and to bring God's life to other people. So if you want to ask yourself, how discipled am I? The right question would be to ask, how much am I bringing life to people in the city? How much am I bringing the gospel, bringing the love of God, bringing the kingdom to people in our city? That's a measure of discipleship. That's very, very provocative. I know that. It certainly is for me. And so that's what Mark here is saying. He's saying that's what the pastor's role is, to train people to do that. That's what a pastor is in a missional church, in a missional culture, to train people to bring that life to the city. That's what discipling people means in this kind of context. Right? Still with me? Any questions for this part? Oh, sorry, I can't see you for the lights.
I'm not really a pastor, so I'm just a guest, but I like very much what I hear. But what also worries me is that you have so much focus on measuring your discipleship, on how much you use your spiritual muscles and stuff. I can't stop worrying about how to bring the freedom and love of Christ to people if you're not first liberating yourself in the face of Christ, and to maintain this faith through the Sunday service. Like you said before, it doesn't matter if you like the music and so on, but don't the church is not also an issue for the church to feed the members who are already there?
Yeah. The big question for that is, thank you for your question. It's a great question, by the way. I think the big question for me is, how do people grow, right? Whether you came to faith yesterday and you just dropped in and you said, yes, I want to believe in Jesus, and you know absolutely nothing, or if you've been a Christian for 5, 10, 20 years, how do people grow, right? And how do I as a pastor feed them? And the more I try and build a missional culture, and I don't at all feel that I always succeed by that. But let me give you an example for being a scattered church. We've been doing healing on the streets. I know some of you have too. It's a great thing. I can only recommend it. It's an amazing thing to be doing. And what I did was I would just bring anybody to the streets with me that wanted to do it. So it doesn't matter if they were, how long they've known God, or even if they did know God. We've had people with us on the street that hadn't really decided to believe in Jesus yet. But one time I took one of the girls out. She's not here. I think she went for a different seminar, so that's great. So don't tell her I told this story. But I took her out in the streets. She was, I think, 18 at the time, and pretty new in our church. And I just said to her, we were on the streets, and it can be a bit scary to just be, in the middle of the main street on a Saturday and people walking by. And I said, you can just stand next to me. And then I said to her, well, you just, you know how to pray, and we'd been going through how you should pray and what you should do if people stop and so on. And then after a while, 2 girls came, they were early 20s, from some Middle Eastern culture, I think. They were definitely not originally Danish. And they stopped and they were like, what's going on here? And they were like, what is this? And I just said, we pray for people, pray for anything. Do you have anything we can pray for, any kind of sickness or pain or anything at all? And one of the girls said, yeah, I've really had a pain in my stomach. It's been all morning and just all day, and it won't go away, and I just don't know what it is. It's really bad. And I said this, that's great, Elsa here, she would love to pray for you. So if you don't mind, she can just pray a quick prayer for you, right? And Elsa, she's like, what? And so I said, okay, that's fine. And then I just let her pray. So she prayed the best prayer she had, and actually she did fine, but she was really nervous, but she did fine. Prayed a quick prayer, and they said thanks, and they went on. And then about, I think maybe 10, 15 minutes later, these 2 girls came back. And she was just stunned because, the pain had left. And she didn't know what to say, this girl, and we just explained about God and so on. Never seen them since that. But just imagine what it does to a girl, to a young girl who's just started coming to the church, who comes to the street, and then she prays for someone for the very first time, and that person actually gets healed from her little tiny nervous prayer. And my point is that is going to equip her and grow her and feed her so much more than any course on, 1 Corinthians, whatever I could do over 8 weeks. This is so much more just doing what Jesus did and just trying to learn to do the same thing. So in terms of feeding the people, for me, this is so much more effective. So that's kind of the same, but this is discipleship in a much more practical way. So I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure if I just twisted it into something I wanted to say, but that's what I think about that, really. All right, let's move on. Yeah. We have time for more questions. Anything else about this scattered? Okay. Right. Yeah, I think it's definitely a valid point, and I think in my sense there's not really much difference. I mean that's probably how I think differently. That for me you could say bringing Jesus. It's about how you phrase it, because you can really phrase it in different ways, and you can say, well, you can say bringing Jesus to people. You can say bringing life to people. You could also say bringing the kingdom to people. And for me, that's probably the best definition, because when you bring the kingdom, that means bringing all the things that are part of the kingdom, right? That means bringing freedom and joy and all of that stuff. And that it's in the kingdom, who is the king? That is Jesus, right? So we do it in his name. But that means if I go out and I give out free meals to the homeless, I don't have to talk about Jesus every time. I can actually just give the meals, I feel, and I can bring that life and that goodness to them. And I am being Jesus to them, but I don't necessarily have to give them sort of a you know what I mean? I think you agree totally with me, right? That I don't have to give them a talk about Jesus, so that's what I mean, actually. That's what I mean. Yeah. All right, let's move on. Gathered environments. So those are the times that we actually do meet together, and the church is together. And how does that become missional as well? And obviously, I think the main thing for me is to make the church not be a subculture, not be a safe place for Christians, not be a place where if you come in from let's say the Danish mainstream culture, and you go into the church, that you feel this huge gap. So there's something about the culture of the place. But there's also something about how we think about our gathered environments, how we plan them, how we execute them, what is our purpose with them. And let me just give you a few of the things that are sort of things that I always talk to people about when I talk about, let's say, especially a church service, but also this goes for a small group as well, by the way. This goes for basically anything we do. So these are some of the main points. First of all, imagine this. I stole this from someone. I'm not sure who I stole this from. But I stole it from Steve Barber. Yeah, he said, imagine if the Queen called you and said, this is the Queen, hello, or the King, or whatever you have in other countries, and said, hello, and said, I have these two friends of mine, and they would love to come and visit your church. So would you make sure they feel welcome when they come? And you say, yes, sure, of course, absolutely. I'll definitely make sure they get a great experience. And so the idea is, so don't you think if they came to the church that Sunday, you would probably make sure that, the coffee was, you didn't like run out of coffee, that you had good coffee. You would probably make sure to put a couple of really friendly faces on the door, someone that actually seems quite nice, and a good and smiling and welcoming. And you would probably make sure that you would have the best worship band. You could probably get up on stage. You would probably make sure you really worked hard on your sermon that particular week, and so on and so on and so on. You would really think, okay, this Sunday has to be perfect, right? Because this is special. And so the argument goes, if that's what you would do, if the Queen sent you a couple of guests, what about the people that Jesus is sending to visit your church, maybe even every week? What would you do for them? So that is kind of just a reminder to myself every Sunday. And I think, it's another Sunday, and Sundays tend to come pretty regularly. And you have to, do the same thing over and over again. You think, yeah, okay, Sunday, I'm a bit busy this week, maybe I could use an old talk or, whatever. And then I just think about, what? There are people coming this week that Jesus himself is sending to our church, and he's saying, would you please welcome these people and really show them what I'm about? And that's really, really good to remember. So that's the first thing. The next thing is this whole idea of being an inclusive church. And that is really, for me, that's become a real sort of buzzword. I've come to a church here in Copenhagen for 10 years where you would always talk about inclusive and including church and inclusive. You can imagine Fleming, if you know him, just talking about that on and on and on. So what does it actually mean? And what I say to my church is this. I say a couple of different things. First of all, I say, you know what? In this church, you can come, you can be part of this church. That's pretty strong language. You can be part of this church no matter what you believe in, no matter where you're from, no matter what country you come from, what your background is, no matter what social status you have, no matter what sexual orientation you have, no matter what political orientation you have, no matter what's going on in your life, you can be part of this church. You're welcome. Sign up on the members list. Go ahead. The only thing that we don't accept is people who create, conflicts. People who talk behind other people's backs, all that stuff. We don't accept that. And the only people who are not welcome are the people who are perfect, who just, have everything in order. They're the only people not welcome in our church. Everybody else is welcome. And that's just one way of saying anybody who wants to is just as much a part of this church as the next person, as the one sitting on the front row and has done so for years, right? So basically it's this principle that you have to belong to the church. The fellowship, in the postmodern culture, fellowship is everything. Show me someone who's, I have a few examples myself, so that's a bad example, but most people that come to faith, they come to faith through fellowship. It's just a fact. And so you have to be able to belong to the church, even though if you don't believe anything. No matter what you believe, no matter what your life looks like, you have to be part of the church. And we have so many people coming to our church that come from other Christian backgrounds where they've been basically just kicked out because something exploded in their lives, something happened. And they got kicked out. They got, maybe they moved in with their boyfriend, or maybe they, I don't know, something, and then they basically, even if they weren't specific, really concretely kicked out, they just felt pushed out, you know what I mean? So everybody's welcome. And if you come to our church, one thing you will definitely notice is just what a strange, odd, weird bunch of people it is, and how you just think, how did these people get into one room with each other? It just makes no sense. It's just from all different kind of countries and ages and different backgrounds, and it's so weird. And I love that about the church. So the basic principle is that people need to belong first. When they do belong, when they feel connected, and they feel loved, and they feel accepted, then we can start to talk about actually believing. So then we would challenge and say, okay, so how about actually, how about this Jesus we've been talking about? Are you ready to receive him? Come on. You've been coming for a while. It's about time maybe you decide to believe that and give him a chance. And then people will maybe respond to that. Sometimes it takes longer than others. And then only after that will we start to look for behaving or see people changing their lives. And sometimes that can take, a long, long, long time for people to change. And people ask me, so what do you do about people acting out this way? Or what do you do about people who live that way? And usually my response is, I just pretty much leave it to the Holy Spirit to sort people out, honestly. And it's not that I'm afraid of conflicts. I'm really not. People who know me will tell you that. I actually kind of like conflicts. I'm a bit like Tom in that. I just think, we should have a little chat. That'll be fun, But I just don't think it's my job, really, to correct people. I really, honestly don't think that's my job. And I see the Holy Spirit doing such a much better job than I ever can. As long as people stay in fellowship, church, small groups, stay in that, they will change. It's just inevitable. Okay, let's have some examples, right? Let's have a few examples. We had one guy. Some of you may have heard this story before. I know you have. We had one guy who he had been to a party on Saturday night. He's about 23 or something. He'd been to a party and it got a bit late. He came home. Then he went in Sunday to get his bike in the city. And we have our services at 3 p.m., so it's in the afternoon. And he found his bike, and he was just walking around to get some air for his bike. We have like these air pumps all over the city. He was just looking for that, and he came just by the place that we have our services. And he got chatting to some of the people. We're just about to start, very randomly. And then they got chatting and explained about the church. But then he said, you know what, I'm not really into this. They invited him in, but he's like, I'm not really into this religious stuff. And then one of our guys, he's about 60 years old, and he just looked at him. He said, I don't think they are either. No, you should come in. He said, oh, okay. So he came in, sat on the second row through the entire service, didn't know anybody. And then at the end of the service, I always, every Sunday, whoever's speaking always asks after the talk. So we've explained about Jesus and all that. Does anyone here want to receive Jesus and start believing him? And sure enough, his hand came up. It's the first time he's ever there. And I was just as amazed as everybody else. I'm like, really? I always feel like that. I'm always, are you sure? So we prayed and talked to him a little bit afterwards. And then he pretty much just started coming to services. He started coming to small groups. And we just baptized him this Sunday. This is about 6 months ago. So that's one story. Other stories are people who come and maybe they come for the first time to maybe a party or a barbecue, something like that. We get to meet them a little bit, get to know them a little bit. Maybe we invite them for church and they come maybe just once in a while, but we just get to know them. And sometimes it can be a really long and drawn-out process for people to come to faith. We have one girl in our small group that we've been kind of trying to get to know now since, I don't know when, since maybe sometime November, December, and she's been hanging around the church a little bit, knowing some of the people, and then finally after 4 or 5 months, I said to her, we have this prayer course we're going to do in our small groups. All the small groups are going to go through a course of praying for 6 weeks. And why don't you join that? That would be something, just something for you. She's like, okay, I'll come. What time? So she decided to come, and she actually started going to small group. And now she's still not really decided on Jesus. She knows what we're trying to do to her, but she's still kind of, I'm not sure about that. But she's part of the small group. I just gave her a Bible that she's reading. She signed up for the 24/7 prayer week we have. Whenever we have small groups, she's getting pictures for other people, and she doesn't know it, but she's getting to know the Holy Spirit. But she's still kind of, trying to figure out if she can see herself in all of this. So this is much more of a process for her to get to know the people as well as what we actually believe in. So I think there's many different, people have many different paths into the church. But the main thing is that when people come in the door the first time, we treat them with the same, the same respect that we treat anybody else that has been there forever. Just one final thing on being inclusive, because I think it's so important. Sometimes we have a cultural thing in our Nordic cultures that's a big issue for us. I don't know if you realize that, but whenever someone new comes into the room, what would you say is the natural response for a Scandinavian person to do? Is it to run over to the new person and say, "Hey, who are you? Let me hear everything about you. Tell me your story"? Or is the natural reaction for a Scandinavian person to maybe look really busy, like I really need to talk to this person right now, one of my friend here, this is much more important. I think you know what I'm getting at, that sometimes in our culture we're just not very good at welcoming people. It's not that we don't want to. It's not that we don't think it's great that they turn up. It's not that we don't think they look like nice people. We're just not very good at doing the actual welcoming. And I try to teach, people in my church, I've learned this little thing from Fleming. He says, sometimes we just have to be more American. That's what he says, basically. We just have to be a little bit more American. "Hey, how are you doing? What's your name? Oh, how did you find the church? Oh, that's great, amazing, wonderful. Oh, so what are you doing? What's your work? What's your blah, blah?" Can you recognize that? That's kind of my Sunday, personality. Seriously. And I'm not doing it to be fake. I just know I have to do this, if I see someone I don't know, I do that. And I try to teach people to do the same. Because in being inclusive is not to say, it's okay that you're here, we accept you, it's all right. We're not gonna throw you out. Being inclusive is to be actively engaging people and bringing them into the fellowship. I say, "Why don't you come over and sit with us?" So I think there's something in that which is just a cultural issue for us. Okay, let's move on. Yeah. Then there's a style. I know you probably, some of you maybe like the whole discussion about style in the music and the setup, and some of you maybe think it's irrelevant. I would say that we do two things in terms of style. First of all, I try to remove anything that even remotely reminds people of church. So we don't meet in a church, first of all. We don't meet and we don't do anything that's kind of, we don't have any things like crosses or anything that has ornaments on it, or anything that just gives people, I don't have I would never wear anything like a shirt and tie or anything like that for church, because that just, again, seems very churchy for some people. And so I just try and remove anything that has kind of a religious thing to it. I remove that. I don't think that's the only way to do it. I think, here in Copenhagen, they have like a big cross on one side. I think that's fine. But I just really try to make it, when you go, the main point for me is when you go into the room, you think, this doesn't look like a church. That's the main thing I want. And we do things like we have a bar that opens at the end of the service, and everybody's like, "Oh, you have a bar and you serve beer? Oh, really? Yeah." We sell 3 beers every Sunday, and one is for the pastor. So I mean, it's not like it's not really a big deal. But everybody is like, "We have the bar," and it just makes it easier for people to kind of connect to that this is different. They have to get the idea this is different. This is not church in the way that I think church is. So that's one thing, make it as unchurchy as possible. And then the other thing is trying to to have kind of a style in that sort of reminds people of something they know, sort of gives them some sort of atmosphere. They think, I've kind of been here before, I know what this is kind of like. Because there's enough things in church that are really weird. I mean, not alone the fact that you stand up and you sing to the wall and like singing love songs to the wall. That's quite weird. So, I mean, there's so many things that are really strange. So I try to make sure that the environment seems kind of recognizable. So, for example, we meet in a place that is usually used for concerts. We put the lighting in a way that it looks like a concert. We have, again, things like meeting in a place that maybe people have even been before. That's a great thing to do. If you can rent some place that people even know that they've been at for some other event. So we actually, if you go to our church, you'll probably think, wow, it's really dark in here. Yes, but who in the world plays loud music with the lights on? Who does that now? Do you know anywhere where they do that except in church? Nowhere. So when you play loud music, you dim the lights. It's just, you have to do things, and you put actual spots on the scene and stuff. So just try and make it seem like something people can relate to, And I think we have a great heritage with the Vineyard music and the way we do worship that we just have to tap into, and maybe just adjust a bit of the surroundings a little bit to make it more recognizable. Okay, we talk about things that, in the preaching, we talk about things that address issues that postmodern people actually think about. So maybe I would ask myself, is this something that a postmodern person would even actually be interested in or ask themselves about? So this year we've been doing series on things like relationships. We've been having a series on sex. That was really interesting. That was a lot of fun too. We would have things like, now we have a thing on prayer, and I think a lot of people are actually very spiritually open and very interested in prayer. How can you pray, and what is prayer, and all that stuff. So trying to find something that, some issues that engage postmodern people. And then as I was getting into earlier, this thing about the church not being a subculture. Think about this. When I am thinking about our service, and maybe we should do something, if we should have some different, maybe alternative thing, and I'm thinking, can we really do this? Does this seem weird? How would people respond to this? One way of thinking that helps me is that our Sunday service is actually a public event. And let me just explain what I mean with that, a public event. Our Sunday service is not an event for our church. It's not like a closed event for our church and then people can come and visit. It's actually a public event that anyone could come to at any time. So whatever I say is actually said in a public space. Do you know what I mean? Whatever is being said from the microphone, whatever happens in the public space. And I can try and magnify that for you a little bit. Imagine that your church service was being broadcasted on the main TV channel of your country. Just imagine that, live from the service. Here we go, Odense Vineyard on Danmarks Radio, right? So if that happened, that would probably make me think a little bit about some of the way I would say things and explain things. Maybe I would phrase things a little bit differently. Can you follow? Maybe there are things that I would, really think through. Does this really make sense to some Danish person sitting in their living room? Did they get what I mean? And actually, I try to do that. I mean, obviously, it's a bit extreme to think like that, but I just try and do that and think anybody who comes in here could be completely new to all of this stuff. Completely blank to anything I say, unless I explain it just like that. So I try to think as a service, as a public thing, and anything that goes on has to be able to sort of suffer, really, a public eye or suffer that people have no reference will be experiencing it. That's what I mean. Another thing we do to make gathered environments missional is, and I guess that's maybe a bit simple, but we always preach the gospel. So whenever someone's speaking, no matter who's speaking, no matter what they're speaking on, I mean, they could be speaking on finances or whatever. I always say, no matter what you do, you have to, at some point in your talk, explain the gospel. And that's sounds easy, but it's actually really hard, because what does the gospel even sound like in a postmodern language? That's a whole totally different seminar, how do I explain the gospel to postmodern people? But I have to get to it at some point. So any preaching would always have like a few minutes where the gospel all of a sudden comes up, and the whole talk is related to the gospel. And we explain what Jesus did on the cross and what God's great mission is in this world. And that makes it so much easier to invite people to faith afterwards. So we also have that, as I was explaining before, we have that opportunity at the end every Sunday to receive Jesus, to respond. And the reason we do that is, first of all, we have guests almost every Sunday. We have someone who's not a Christian, and we want to give that opportunity. But it's also that if we do that, if you don't have a lot of visitors in your church, think about it this way: if you begin to do that, to invite people to receive Christ every Sunday, people will actually start bringing their friends, because they know they will get that question. And that's really powerful. And it also sets a whole, it sets a whole lot of idea and identity about what we're about, right? It speaks so much that we ask that question every Sunday. And then the final thing is, I think it's very helpful to have kind of a roadmap for visitors. So we would say things like, we would have information bits on every Sunday, and probably about 60% of that is only for the new people. So we would repeat the same stuff every Sunday for just for the new people. Like, if you're a new person here, we have a contact card. You can use that for this. We have a welcoming dinner that such and such is going on. We're explaining who we are. You're very welcome to do that. We have small groups. What we do in a small group is this, blah, 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 blah. You're very welcome to visit that. So we have a lot of things for new people so that we know where we want them to go, actually. Let me just ask you one thing. If you have a new person coming to visit your church service, what would actually be your goal for them? What do you want them to, how do you want them to progress into the church? What is like the next step for them? Where do you want to bring them? For me, I would definitely want to bring them into fellowship. I want to bring them to a welcoming dinner. I want to bring them to a small group, and I want to bring them to faith. So I just have a number of things I really want to see happen for them to get involved in the church. And then finally, I want to bring them into ministry in some kind of way, to serve somehow. So we have something that we know, this is what we want people to go through, to get integrated. First of all, I think anybody who visits a church, especially if they're not Christians, they're terrified, basically. I mean, they're terrified from the moment they walk in. And what we need to do is surprise them in a positive way, that it's not as terrible as they thought it would be to be in there. But obviously, it doesn't always have to do with the church. I'm also terrified when I'm with a group of people I don't know. I remember when I was starting to play with my football team in our new city, and I didn't know any of them, not one. I mean, there was one guy I had met maybe once or twice, but that's it. So I was terrified. So it's just a social thing. And it's funny to see people when they're new and they sit on the back row, and then after a month they sit like on the third row, and then maybe after a couple more months they sit on the second row. It's always funny to see how people move forward as they feel more comfortable being in the church. So I think you definitely need to have a sense of it's easy to escape the Sunday service. I can sit on the back row and the door's right there, and if I want to leave unnoticed, I can do that. That's very important. The easier you make it for people to escape, the more likely is they will come back, actually, and give it another try. But then on the second hand, what I want to see is, if you have a new person coming for the first time, that people would come and greet them, and I would hope they would be invited to at least 2 or 3 small groups just that first time. That there would be at least 2 or 3 people coming and inviting them to their small group. And obviously, most people will just be totally terrified and say, no thanks, that's just a bit, overwhelming. But that's not the point. The point is that they will go home and think, wow, that's really crazy that they would invite me. They don't know me. So there's something about being invited, being overwhelmingly included, that people would usually back off, but they would go home and they would tell people about it, and they would be really shocked, and they would probably, make an impression on them. So there's kind of, do you know what I mean? It's kind of both, that we should leave them alone, but also we should actually overwhelm them a little bit, because that's a statement. This whole thing about bringing Jesus to people and, going out and actually bringing Jesus to the friends, to the people I know, I realized very quickly that if I didn't do that as the pastor, nobody would do that, right? So if I want to have a missional culture in our church, I'm going to get to that right at the end. It really has to start with me doing that. And I'm very good at doing church and being in here with a microphone and all that. That's very comfortable for me. It's very different when you're sitting with your football team, in the locker room and drinking beer and saying, hey, so, do you know Jesus? That's a very different thing. So being able to doing that myself moving into that, that's probably been the most challenging. But I'll get to that at the end. I think we have about, 20 minutes? So let me just go through. The final is, a few thoughts on how you build culture, and what we do, especially as leaders, how we can, what we do to build culture, what we actually practically do to build a culture. So let's have the final couple of slides. And I've divided it up into 3 things, is what you say as a leader, and what you do, and then the third one is what you celebrate as a leader. So let's go through the first one, is what you say. One of the things we've done is to have a really simple sort of vision statement. It's actually not really a vision statement, it's more like a slogan, the kind of thing you can have on the back of a t-shirt. So in our statement in our church is, in English it would be pass it on. In Danish it's giv det videre. So it means, it's just really very short. It doesn't really say anything, first of all. But if you go into it, it actually says quite a lot. Because if you have to pass something on, first of all, you need to have something to, give it to someone else. So we've got something from God. The second thing it says is we didn't get it just for ourselves. We got it to give it. We got it to give it. And that's what we're all about. We're all about giving it to someone else. So that's like this really, simple statement that doesn't really say much, but it says something about who we are, what we want to do. And I would regularly bring that up and say, this is why we have this statement, and I would explain it again and again and again. So that's one way of putting the culture into words. Here in Copenhagen, the statement is included, inspired, involved, which also says a lot about what the church is about. Then you need to have language for the purpose of the church. And those are some of the things that I've already mentioned. Using what kind of language I would use in front of the church to explain why we're here. Things like no perfect people allowed. We all come here as broken people. We all bring everything that we are into the church, all of our, burdens and faults and all the things we've experienced and everything. We bring that into the church, and that's okay. There's space for that. That the church doesn't exist for itself, but for the city and bringing life to people and all of that. So that's the kind of language I would use. And it's all about finding a language that you can use that explains the missional culture. So I would, and you would ask, so when would you bring this up? I would probably bring this up at least every time I preach, and also at any time we have any kind of meeting, any kind of leadership meeting, welcoming dinner, anything like any time where I'm kind of talking about the church and God, I would bring these things up in some way or another. And then there's one thing I found very interesting as well is when I engage with people who are outside the church, and especially when you're a pastor, you get this question a lot. So, what do you do? And you say, oh, well, I'm a pastor. And you say, oh, really? What does that mean? And so on. So you get a lot of conversations like that. And what I've found is one of the best ways to open up a really positive conversation with someone is to talk about what the church is not. And to talk about, all of the things that have been done in the name of God, in the name of Christianity, and in the name of the church through the times that are just terrible. Because we live in many ways, a post-Christian culture and a culture that has rejected religion, rejected the church because of all the sins. There are also many lots of things, even in the present, there are all the scandals in the Catholic Church, there are all the, you look at some of the things that come out of churches, what churches say about maybe homosexuals, what churches say about, all kinds of things. So very often I would begin explaining the gospel by explaining all the things that it's not. And it's amazing how effective it is. I could say something like, our church is it's a very untraditional church. And sometimes I would even say it's a kind of church for people who wouldn't normally go to church, really. Those kind of words. And it maybe seems a little bit strange, but you would be amazed how many people define themselves that they don't want to go to church only because they associate it with something they have heard or something they have read or whatever. And then finally, telling God's big story. So when we talk about what the church is about, we talk about not just our church and our city, but we talk about the big story, the story that's the entire Bible, how God created the world, and the people of the world turned this back to God, and with all the suffering that came along with that and so on. And then we tell a story about how God saw the world's pain and decided to act. And what he decided to do was to send his son to bring the kingdom of God to us. And so we simply explain this entire, the big story and say, and that's what happened, that Jesus came and he started this movement called the church, and it's spreading all over the world. And, now this thing has come to you. That's why you're here. This is what we are. We're part of this amazing story over many thousands of years. And we put it into a context. So our mission is suddenly a huge, worldwide thing, and not just our little church. So that's another thing I would do. So that's the things I would say. Things you would do to build a culture. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, especially if you're a leader or a pastor, and you say, I want to have this, I want to build this culture in our church. I want our church to have this missional DNA and really to, bring Jesus to people outside the church and so on. So obviously the question for me to myself is, when is the last time I invited someone to our church? When did I invite someone to our church? When is the last time I prayed for someone, not in church, not some of the usual suspects that we have in church every Sunday or in my small group, but when is the last time I prayed for someone who don't yet know Jesus? When did that happen? When is the last time I had a conversation with someone outside the church building where I actually told them about Jesus and kind of explained what he's about? When is the last time I prayed for someone outside a church building, which is, again, the whole thing about bringing life to people means, outside. And more questions. When is the last time I actually had a conversation with someone about faith and actually ended up leading them in a prayer of faith? And finally, when is the last time someone got healed from one of my prayers? I prayed for someone that actually got healed. And I have to tell you, when I moved to plant the church with the rest of the team, I looked at these questions myself because I knew this is probably going to be, if I have to look at myself first, if I want this culture. And I was pretty dismayed, to be honest. I looked at these things and I thought, yeah, maybe one or two, I could say, within the last year, something like that. Right? I don't know where you're on this one. For some of you, I know it's probably very different. But I just had to think, have someone ever been healed from one of my prayers? I'm not sure. When is the last time I led someone through a prayer of faith? I don't know. Probably 12, 14 years ago, or something like that. I'm not sure that's true, though. But, I just looked at these questions and I thought, this is probably not very good. So something has to happen. And again, this is what was my biggest challenge in terms of planning a church, to realize that I have to do something about this, and I have to change, and I have to grow in these things, and it's the only way we're going to see this happen in the church, very simply. So I would say that these questions will look very differently for me now, and I would have been through pretty much all of these, within the last month or two, just from doing it and trying to just keep doing it and keep doing it. And the thing is, you think, well, I just have to get into it, and then you do it a little bit, and then after a while, you just kind of relax again, and you kind of forget it a little bit, and you think, yeah, well, now the church should be fine now. I've sort of shown the way, and now the church can do it. It doesn't work that way. I have to keep doing it. I have to live it. I have to be in it all the time. I have to model it, and that's the only way I can teach the Christians how to be effective missionaries in the city. And then the final thing, or the second to last thing, is what you celebrate. And Tom actually said something about that in the morning, right? That what you celebrate is what grows. So whatever you lift up as a leader, whatever you put up on the stage, whatever you talk about, whatever you praise, that's what other people will do. So first of all, as a leader, I have to tell my own stories. I have to share the stories that the people that I shared God with, the people that I invited. And I have to tell both the good stories where people got healed and it was amazing, but also, I prayed for this guy and, nothing happened. But at least I did it. You know what I mean? I actually did tell this person about Jesus. I felt God was kind of leading me to do it, and that person just said, whatever, dude. So tell the risk-taking you've done, both the successes and the failures, are very, very important, I think. Because if you never tell about your failures, nobody will dare to do it. Because they will fail the first time and they will just stop. Share testimonies at our church services. We try to do that as much as we can. Whenever we have any kind of encouraging story about someone's life, we bring them up personally and to just share a little bit of a testimony after the worship. Anything that we think is great, anything, that God has done, anything like that. When I preach, I try to tell stories about people who brought Jesus to others. About missional stories. Try and celebrate those and retell those and sort of bring them up, sort of lift them up. Another thing you can do is actually to invite someone. We have guest speakers, regularly, and I just try and invite someone who really has a very strong missional culture, some really strong DNA, who just can mess people up a little bit. The best we've had with that was someone like Mark Marks, who started Healing on the Streets. He's definitely gonna mess with people's heads, the stories he's telling and the things he's doing and so on. And so just invite someone who's just doing it, and can model it for us. And then I think another thing that maybe is overlooked a little bit is that we actually tell what's going on. We actually share sometimes some statistics and numbers about what's happening. I've decided once and for all that all this nonsense about a big church and small church, and some churches are growing and some are not, and how many people came to faith and how many people were healed and all of that stuff. It's all, it's always about something about numbers and people counting, and you think, what when you say that, when you talk about the church has grown with 20 people, are you bragging or whatever? I think sometimes we just have to talk about numbers, really. We just have to say, we had this weekend where we prayed for people and 30 people got healed. It's amazing, right? It's just amazing. I had one guy, he had never seen a healing before. He saw 11 people's leg grow out in a weekend. And he was like, 11. He'd never seen a healing before. So I think when we talk about what God is doing, we talk about people coming to faith, people getting healed and so on, use numbers. Just tell what's going on. Tell the stories, but also tell the numbers. I think it's amazing. Sometimes to just show statistics and say, when I say we have 30% in our church that it's their first church, I'm just celebrating that. I'm not bragging. I'm just celebrating. It's amazing. I've never been in a church before that has that. Never. So I just think it's wonderful. So finally, just my final thoughts, and I'll let you go. I think I've been hearing my own voice for a while now. Just a few final thoughts, about the missional culture. First of all, begin with yourself. There's no way around that. There's no way you can kind of skip that point where you begin with yourself. With the questions I had before, when is the last time I did this? And then Rich Nathan always says, when he does these kind of things, he just says, you know what, if you don't know what to do, just do something. Do something. Just, I don't know, should I do healing on the streets, or should I do this or that, or what should I? Just do something. Just tell someone about Jesus. Just pray for someone. Just mess it up. Second thing, invite someone to church. It's kind of the first thing, the first basic thing, that you just have friends around you, maybe people you work with, whatever. Invite them to come to church and hear about Jesus. Just invite them. Again, pray for someone to get healed. If you haven't seen anyone get healed, maybe ever, or maybe just for a long time. What John Wimber, he had this amazing wisdom. He said, if you want to see more people get healed, you should probably pray for more people. It makes sense to me, just pray for more people. So just find a way to do that. And then finally, the thing that'll really get you going is the next time you lead someone to Jesus, the next time you explain someone, the gospel to someone, explain about the cross, and you say, do you know what? I think this could be the time for you. What would you like to receive this? And I've had that experience actually quite regularly lately, and every time when people say, yeah, every time I'm like, no way. I can't believe you said yes. Why would anyone say yes? It just seems so out of this world, and that's because if you don't ask, they never say yes. So that's really the thing that's going to get you going, because you really want more of that. So just ask someone, and when they say yes, pray for them. Do whatever I don't know what to do. I don't even know how to lead people to Jesus. I just ask them, and then I think, okay, we should probably pray. That's probably the next step. That's how I feel every time. So that's it. I think that's all I have. So thanks for listening.